Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Season 1, Episodes 7 and 8. Really, these episodes, in all actuality, man, do they just kind of go into the fact that, yeah, we don't really have freaking nothing to write about in these two episodes. Man, instead of making, a very cool, end of this show, where it's really awesome and battle or fight or whatever war towards the end of the show. No, the last two episodes are just yeah, let's do an entire story about this person in one episode, and then the next episode is just an entire story about one person at the end of an episode. What do these stories go into and what do they do? Not a lick of nothing. They don't do jack crap nothing, really, for me, for this story. And to ultimately, we have more interesting things going on, I think, in season 2, episodes 1 and 2, much more so than in these two episodes. They're honestly just bizarrely filler episodes. What a weird thing to do. Hey, we have 2 episodes left, so let's just fill time. Because honestly, that's what it feels like these 2 episodes are. It honestly felt to me like I was like, why am I getting these episodes? What do they have any tying to much of the characters? It looks like they just kind of had, nothing better to do. So, alright, let's go into these 2 episodes. If anything, I think I made a mistake about Salim. Ultimately, yeah, evidently I was thinking, he was the wrong actor, Salim. Ultimately, I was thinking he was in the movie Venom, but I guess I was incorrect about that. Ultimately, I know that he's in Hunger Games Part 2, because ultimately IMDb is a good friend of mine. I guess he was in Love, Death, and Robots, I think is the show. I could be wrong about that. But anyways, we ultimately, again, Salim really isn't even in this. He isn't even in these episodes. Barely, if anything. Or whatever he is in there for, it's just So, going on into this, the bulk of these 2 episodes are kind of flashback things that have absolutely nothing to do with the current stories. These 2 episodes are basically about a girl named, in the first episode, we have it to where it's an episode about Essie McGowan. Sure. Kind of telling us a backstory about leprechauns, and ultimately the episode after that is all about Bilquis, and ultimately you have Mr. Nancy who comes back and is narrating this story. Really, I thought both episodes were just kind of I don't understand the point of these, but when looking at them, I guess there's also still that element of well, you do get at points a lot of times where you have within these 2 episodes some bedroom business, I guess you could say, or otherwise some sex within these 2 episodes, and also some people with less than any kind of clothes really on. So really, I guess you could just say that that's a plus when going into these 2 episodes. I just feel that overall I'm okay, but what is if anything, I feel like we're, for the most point in the Bilquist episode, we're kind of pulling back a little bit from what we've done in previous episodes, tying in Bilquist. I don't think that recently Bilquist had what was it was just to kind of tell us her backstory, which I thought was fascinating. But what was the main goal? Oh, just putting her on the chessboard, so to speak, and just saying oh yeah, she's she's with so and so people, because I can't say that because spoilers. Um, Going into season two, I'll talk about that, and eventually season two, the review of that. Um, so yeah, let's go into just spoilers of this episode. They're really, I'm probably going to be doing this probably as quickly as humanly possible. So there's probably going to be stuff that isn't exactly going to be heavily detailed and whatever. Because when looking at it, it's just like these episodes were just, they were just, they were like, so are we going to get to the normal episode, the normal stuff? Is this going to tie into the episodes? Not really. Okay. I kind of figured that there would be some kind of. I kind of figured there would be some kind of weird, like, hey, let's tie way too much into one person for one episode, but I didn't think it would be the very last episode to focus too much on one person. I'm like, normally for a season finale, you really gotta, like, give it, like, a huge bang for your buck. But I think for this one, it's like, meh, like, dude, we're adapting this from a novel, and really, we're just kind of like, meh, whatever we're gonna do is whatever we're gonna do. So, in 8 episodes, there's only so much you can kind of like think of what is the most important. But I think Bilquist, like, the story was interesting, but when looking at it, it kind of felt like a less than compared to what they were doing in the beginning of this show with Bilquist. It kind of just feels like, oh, well, you know what she's doing. And I'm like, uh, really? You kind of had to, like, do things off camera this time around? Sure. Anyways, as well as seemingly a lot of the activity, let's say, is almost seemingly off camera almost, or just kind of like, yeah, we're gonna kind of show something, but it's gonna be a little bit cleaner now, like as if like, hey, yeah, we really wanted to desperately change the rating of the show to going from like a hard R to like we're gonna clean it up by the end of the episode. That's what we're gonna try to do. Okay, sure. All right. I guess it's that way they can clean up their commercials. I guess for this, they can figure out what to show on their commercials. I don't know. I was confused. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm gonna spoil these episodes. So these episodes were just okay, but I just didn't care. That's a sad point. It's like I like there wasn't anything in these episodes that kind of narrowed down to me like why I needed to invest in Laura Moon or anybody more. The girl that ultimately played Essie McGowan or the Leprechaun. Which ultimately spoilers this first episode ties into, and then I was just like, well, what makes Bilquis even much more of a threat via this episode compared to where she was in the beginning of this? Because ultimately, I could have seen, like, I saw more of her being a threat in this very early episode than I did in here. And here, I'm just like she even like faltered at one point and ultimately had to be taken back into the promised land to ultimately just be like, hey, uh like you're still a god, so ultimately we just gotta remind you that you are one, and ultimately like get you back to to where you were. And ultimately Bilquis does do that. But anyways, so this first episode is really again tying the Leprechaun's backstory to, I guess, Laura at some point, because it seems that the Leprechaun had known a girl that looked like Laura from his past. So we ultimately have it to where there is some old lady telling this girl about this story about the leprechaun and how reasonably um, this girl needs to leave bread consistently out for the leprechaun to nibble on. And so this girl eventually does so. And so we have it to where this girl ultimately ends up trying to, of course, as per usual, find men to eventually be with. But eventually she just otherwise decides, like, you know what? Like, how would I just steal things? How would I just rob things? Ultimately, she ends up with men that she doesn't want, but ultimately she just ends up with them just to use them, really. Uh, and ultimately she ends up in prison for these acts, and ultimately she ends up on ships and everything like that, where ultimately she sleeps her way into getting people to pardon her for her crimes, or ultimately she just weds people to ultimately get away from all of this. And we have it to where Laura and the leprechaun are ultimately in current time going on a road trip where ultimately they see some white bull of sorts, and ultimately I think they're in Wisconsin. Ultimately they are with Salim, and ultimately we have Laura who is just telling Salim, it's like, hey, like I think it's your time to go. Like we're gonna separate ourselves from you. If anything, Salim, I found out evidently. Salim must have this ability to be able to touch people, and ultimately he can kind of see their inner demon within them. Hence why I was very confused about Salim before. I'm like, what is Salim about? Like what it like I didn't quite understand the whole Salim thing before, but now I figured this out. As well as in the last review, I ultimately mentioned this thing called the Giving Tree, which ultimately was an old fashioned book from years ago. Um, but ultimately, I guess the tree character that was killing people in the police station is just called Mr. Wood. I'm like, God, that has to be the lamest name that I've ever heard in my life. But evidently, Mr. Wood is a character that goes and is the god of the forest, and ultimately, he just, I guess, has the ability to, uh, like Mr. Wood, ultimately can have be the eye of the back of the head of some person, I guess, at some point. But anyways, I guess once he can control people, I guess. I don't know. It was very confusing what they were talking about. But anyways, on to Salim. So in that story, where ultimately we have it to where the Jinn is a taxi driver, and ultimately he can't grant wishes, and Salim ultimately is trying to comfort the Jinn, and ultimately touches him, and ultimately sees that he has fire in his eyes. Ultimately, the Jinn is supposed to be an Igfrid, and so we have it to where Salim ultimately had been a person that was trying to sell some product to some guy that was never going to hear him out. And so ultimately, Salim is just selling trinkets to no one who cares. I guess anybody could be familiar with that kind of lifestyle. And so we have it to where Salim eventually touches the Jinn and ultimately tries to comfort the Jinn. And ultimately, we just find out the Jinn is, I guess, just gay. So ultimately, they end up in a bedroom together. And I guess ultimately, I thought that the Jinn was like just consumed by Salim or whatever. I didn't quite understand that. But ultimately, the Jinn just leaves. And we have a tour. Salim is just like, okay, well, I guess I'll just be this cab driver now. I am so confused. I am so confused. What was all that rigmarole going on there? I didn't. That's the whole thing. I didn't understand that whole thing. I guess I had to spell it out and try to figure out what the heck all happened there. Um, but ultimately, Salim is telling people that he can't grant wishes and whatever. But anyways, so we have Salim, who is consistently praying to Mecca, because ultimately he has to look west and pray to Mecca, which is great. Because ultimately he's Muslim, which is perfectly fine. So they ultimately have to stop a lot because Salim has to pray a lot, and so ultimately that's when Laura and the leprechaun ultimately cut ties with Salim, ultimately just saying it's like, hey, nothing wrong with you praying. It's just like, hey, we just want to go our separate ways. Because ultimately, like, Salim is just kind of a normal human being. He's an innocent and all this, so ultimately they just want to cut ties with him before ultimately he ends up dead or something like that. So they just don't want. Ultimately, Laura is growing a conscience with Salim and just ultimately just thinking like, you know what, like he's too nice of a guy. Ultimately, he's probably gonna end up dead, and I just don't want his bloody carcass on my noggin for the rest of my life if he dies. So we'll just cut ties with him. So really, that is just kind of all that is really just tied into the current time of really irrationally much of this story. Uh, for the early portions of or for this episode, everything else is just, hey, let's keep talking about Elsie McGowan through this entire episode, where again she kind of just like keeps getting all these kinds of guys that are ultimately at one point she's in a prison on a boat, but ultimately she marries like the captain of the ship. Ultimately she gets away with that, but eventually she runs off, and eventually she ends up in jail, where ultimately she sleeps with the jailer, and ultimately she gets away from out of the jail as well, while also talking to seemingly the leprechaun in some kind of flashback form. And even at times when this girl has apps, like basically she's given nothing to eat, ultimately she leaves crumbs for the leprechaun. So that way to keep the tradition of leaving some kind of food out for the leprechaun. And we have a tour eventually. We have this girl eventually get married and eventually have kids and eventually grow old and everything along those lines. And so eventually we have it to where the leprechaun ultimately comes to Essie as an old woman. And he's like, yeah, like I've really appreciated like the years and years and years of you like leaving crumbs out for me. I really appreciate it. And that ultimately just kind of like sums up that episode. We ultimately have the leprechaun who is talking to her like through the other jail cell and she didn't even know. And I thought that that was kind of interesting how they were like kind of tying one another in together. It was kind of interesting. But yeah, that's really just kind of as much as that story kind of goes into. It kind of didn't like put a full effort into because it's like to me, it's like these episodes are just kind of throwaways. To be brutally honest, they are sadly, but that doesn't make them any less interesting than some of the other episodes. But I honestly don't like flashback episodes either. I don't like hey, let's go back into like 1884 or whatever, and like I don't like an entire episode like that. I did enjoy it where they had it like in the very beginning of the episode and then like they went in back into current time. I don't like an entire episode where it's flashing back to something because I just don't care for that kind of thing. I'm like, but how does that have anything has any reference to the current time of things? It's like, well, no, it's just telling the backstory of this person. I'm like, yeah, so it's kind of like watching like Star Wars, like episode one, two, and three, and knowing that this person is gonna live throughout this entire time. Like if it's not like if it doesn't have enough action in it, or it doesn't have them going through every single war of like if it was like Wolverine and like Wolverine like goes through every single war and fights every single war, like I could see how that could be interesting. But like I don't see like just a woman just sleeping with everybody like through time. Um to just kind of keep kind of doing whatever she wants anyways is a very like wow, this story is fascinating. I can't wait for her to sleep with another man just so she could be able to just get away from things. Which is kind of how the Bilquist story kind of goes into that same route. Like, if anything, like the Bilquist story, there's not much of a route where her sleeping with people is going to like benefit her in any way. Like she doesn't sleep with an enemy to kill. Well, she does in the early portion of the episode, but after that, it's just kind of like, okay, I'll just sleep with this guy that I find, and so on and so forth, and that will work out. Um, but then it kind of like the Bilquist episode kind of goes into more current time towards the tail end of it, towards like, oh, okay, like it's like that's kind of interesting how technical boy ultimately goes and kind of gives her the ability of being able to be this like brand new person in more current time, and that was interesting. So yeah, so the Bilquist episode we have to where ultimately Bilquist seems to be a queen of an empire. I guess during Egyptian time, I believe, or in Egypt, I think. I could be wrong about that, and I probably am. But anyways, we have a tour. Mr. Nancy's telling this story about a queen, and I was like, man, like every time, like if anything, I don't like. I may not care about this episode, but I really cared about like just Mr. Nancy just narrating this thing. I thought that was interesting. How like every time he was talking, I was like yeah, I don't like. Maybe there's just some parts of this episode I'm like meh, but ultimately just the narration kind of just won me over. So we have it to where we have Bilquist that ultimately is just this queen of this empire, and it seems like there's men and women just kind of walking around in this place of sorts that Bilquist has amassed, and they're just all walking around with basically just the crown on their heads, so to speak, or their Egyptian like necklaces or jewelry or whatever, and that's about it. So we ultimately have it to where it seems that there is some people eventually just vying for Bilquist's throne, let's just say. And so they end up trying to go for her throne, ultimately to just be like, dude, this is freaking Bilquist. Like any man or woman that's going to come to her, it's going to be all for naught. So Bilquist ends up consuming, of course, this man that ends up trying to come for her throne. And then eventually, Bilquist just goes, like, you know what? I'm just going to consume every single one of my followers. F it. Like, I'm going to take all of them. And so we have it to where Bilquist eventually we just have to just kind of have her kind of go through these like ups and downs, like through portions of time. We have like the disco era where ultimately she like meets women and just starts consuming women and stuff like that. And we have it to where eventually she like goes on a bus and consumes a man, ultimately asking like, "Hey, can you tell me where the bathroom is?" And ultimately he goes and consumes or he consumes a person on a like airplanes, buses, everywhere, just consuming people. So we have it to where we have it to where Bilquist eventually, seemingly eventually, we find out that her empire has been that she had built. Ultimately, eventually gets destroyed or gets knocked down, and ultimately we were finding Bilquist to eventually just be knocked down herself, to where ultimately she is more and more just kind of eventually fading into the ether, to where she is becoming homeless and not looking so great. And ultimately, you have it to where that whole knocking of ego thing ultimately takes Bilquist out to ultimately just go, like, you know what, like, I don't think I'm the queen that I think I am anymore, and that's what eventually turns her into a very much like lower leveled person that ultimately turns homeless and ultimately just kind of like her face isn't what it would normally look like just because like she's just kind of like she doesn't have the consuming efforts that she would normally have. Kind of like an interesting kind of like turnaround kind of story. So, but again, I thought that this was quasi fascinating. But again, it was just kind of like running through the motions of just like, well, we need to tell the backstory of this person because we just haven't really shown her through this entire season with the exclusion of just early on, and now we have to like do something to show like what we're going to do with this person because basically season 2 is just kind of going on to like, okay, well, we're going to go back to like Shadow Moon being an important thing, and like F everything else. So ultimately, I guess Bilquis needed to be put into this first season bottled in there because ultimately she's just gonna eventually go where she goes in this show. So Bilquis ultimately is eventually kind of just again homeless, and we ultimately have Technical Boy who comes in to ultimately mention to her that's like, hey, like the route of which that this time has taken is we need followers. We need to have as many numbers of people as we can possibly get. So I'm going to give you a cell phone now, and this cell phone is going to have a dating app. So you go ahead and you date as many of these men as you want or women, because ultimately, basically, like try to consume as many people as you can, because ultimately there's a war coming, and so we ultimately have it uh, to where Mr. Nancy is telling this story, and we have it to where ultimately, while he's telling this story, we have Mr. Wednesday and Shadow Moon hearing all about uh, queens and stuff like that, and that's kind of where the reason for why Mr. Nancy is telling this story to both Mr. Wednesday and Shadow Moon. Because ultimately they need to eventually find their queen, and ultimately they are assuming that it could be any number of uh, women that they eventually ask. So, reasonably, that's all that I had to really say about this review. Like, it's probably quicker than normal reviews, just because reasonably, again, uh, these episodes were really easy to talk about. They were kind of easy, straightforward, and ultimately, they're just and I went through 2 episodes that I didn't have to take an hour talking about them. Isn't that great? Because ultimately, I know a lot of people would ultimately just like, dude, like I want these videos shorter. Yeah, for this one, it's basically there's not much to say. There's like, if anything, there's not much into these last 2 episodes for me, as far as the season finale goes. But I think I was happy that Bilquist got some important thing going on here because I'm like, I kept getting really super annoyed. I'm like, when are they going to go back to Bilquist? When is this going to happen? And then, surefire enough, they wait to the very last episode, like I assumed that they probably would anyways, to do something with Bilquist. And I'm like, oh, okay, so finally, just like, yeah, go ahead and tell that story. But if anything, these stories are just kind of a means to an end of just kind of eventually just getting into the next season, into season 2. So I guess what these episodes really were, I guess it was just like, Matt, I don't really care because I just want to get back. I just want to kind of finish all these episodes up to eventually get to the end of season 2. And I ultimately had started watching the first 2 episodes of season 2. So ultimately, I will eventually talk about those as well in another video, which eventually will be coming soon. So yeah, that's all that I wanted to say about American Gods, the first season. Ultimately, I'm probably just gonna have to change the playlist of this because I think it's ultimately just saying like American Gods season one review. I think I'm just gonna say American Gods review because I'm just gonna keep doing this through season two to just kind of keep it all in one thing. Um, but anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.